Welcome to Chapter 5, guys. Colonial Society on the Eve of Revolution, 1700 to 1775. This chapter takes a look at what the colonies were like during this time period leading up to the American Revolution. The first thing we see here is that the colonies had become quite populated by 1775. 2.5 million people lived in the colonies. 500,000 of those were African Americans. 400,000 were immigrants, but the rest were born here naturally through reproduction in the colonies. The colonies are doubling their numbers about every 25 years, and the average American in 1775 is about 16 years old. Now, I explained in class that that number seems a little strange. It's not like everyone is 16 years old walking around the colonies. It's more the fact that there are lots of children in the colonies at this time, which brings that number down significantly. We see here that in 1700 the English are outnumbering the colonists 20 to 1, but that margin is quickly falling. By 1775, now we're only outnumbered 3 to 1. And as you can suspect, the most populous colonies in this particular order are Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and then Maryland. Most colonists are rural, about 90% in 1775, which means that there are very few cities. There are, in fact, only about 4 real cities by 1775. Those include Philly, New York City, Boston, and Charleston. Now, Charleston today is not what we would consider a major city, but at that time it was the largest southern seaport, and it's quite important, especially to the southern colony. We do have a significant amount of immigration by this time. I will focus on the Scots-Irish more than the Germans, but the Germans are about 6% of the population, and most of them are living in Pennsylvania. I do want to talk about the Scots-Irish a little bit more. That's 7% of the population in 1775. And if you take a look at the map here, to the right, you see the area of land that those individuals are settling, primarily in the Appalachian Mountains. Now, they're moving to this region to stay away from the East Coast and to stay away from, British people. So they're perfectly content with going out to the Appalachian Mountains and settling there on their own. That includes parts of eastern Kentucky, which we're familiar with, East Tennessee. If you travel to those regions and listen to the dialects and listen to the music and things that come out of that region, you can understand that those are very Irish influenced. So there is a significant amount of diversity in the colonies. The colonies at this time are the most diverse places in the world. We have Huguenots, Welsh, Dutch, Swedes, Jews, Irish, and Swiss that have immigrated here. Now, this presentation talks about how this is a melting pot of nationalities. Of course, we talked about in class how we prefer to call that a salad bowl. New England is the least diverse region. It's primarily white. It's primarily Puritan. The diversity lies primarily in the middle colonies. There are both economic and ethnic diversity located in this region. We see an interesting fact here that of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 18 were non-English and 8 were not even born in the colonies. As we discussed, most Americans are farmers. They're involved in some sort of agriculture, whether that be growing a garden or having a large plantation. Most colonial Americans are doing some sort of farming, okay? Ministers are the most respected people in the community, and we talk about how there's no nobility in the American colonies. One thing I want to focus on here is social mobility. The true rags to riches story of the American dream is already being felt prior to the American Revolution. Social mobility at this time in the world is the highest in the colonies. You can come here and be completely broke, and then end up being very well off. Okay, that is not something that is happening in the English countryside, and it's not happening anywhere in Europe either at this time. So people are coming here to strike it rich. Okay, by the mid-1700s, the number of poor people in the America colonies remained tiny in comparison to that number in England. The wealth is concentrated in Philadelphia and Boston. However, we do need to understand that the wealthiest people in the colonies are that upper 1% plantation owner in the South. Okay. Also, we do need to understand that the vast majority of the poorest people live in the South, which goes back to our idea of that huge wealth gap that is permeating throughout the southern colonies. Okay, make sure you understand that. The vast majority of the wealth is in the Northeast, but the richest of the rich are the plantation owners in the South, and that's the upper 1% at this time. As I said earlier, most people are involved in agriculture, about 90%, and that includes fishing and whaling. But most people at this time are at least growing some sort of garden to feed their family. On average, life in America was much more prosperous than it was in Europe at that time. And I've said before, and I'll say it again, if I was going to live during this time period, I would want to live in the middle colonies or New England versus anywhere in the world. And I've said it also that I would rather live during this time period in the middle colonies or the New England colonies than many places in today's current world. Triangular trade, we discussed a great deal. You see the chart there on the right. We know this. We can skip through a lot of this stuff. We studied a great deal about the Great Awakening in class. I do want to mention a few things here. Again, this is a series of religious revivals that swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 40s. This does some significant things for the colonies. First of all, it allows people to understand that they can study religion without having to go to church so much. So it does take away some power of the church. But at the same time, it gets people interested in religion again, and it does grow membership in churches, and it does create many new denominations of churches. We talked about two significant people, one being George Whitefield, who was a preacher during this time, and we talked about Jonathan Edwards, also a preacher during this time. He wrote Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, something that we read in class. And if you're not in my course and just watching this video, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is something that shows up on the APUSH test often, and it's definitely something that you need to focus on when you're studying the Great Awakening. Many colleges were founded during this time period out of the Great Awakening. Many of our Ivy League schools are considered new light colleges found during this time period. You know, colleges like Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Brown, Columbia, Princeton. These are significant bastions of education still today in the United States, and we need to understand where they came from. They came from the Great Awakening. Traditionally, England isn't huge on education, and that's not so in the colonies. The colonies decided they wanted to educate their people, especially those in New England. We learned that if a town had 50 or more families, they were forced to have an elementary school for the children. This goes to show us the early importance of education in the region. And that has extended to today. When we think of best educational areas of the United States, we still think of New England. So that's a significant historical marker. Here again, we see the colleges and how they were founded. Now, The chapter tries to discuss culture and the arts, and what I want you to know is there's not a ton of artistic expression going on in the colonies at this time. But there is one individual that we would like to make mention of. His name is Benjamin Franklin. One of the things he's credited for is writing Poor Richard's Almanac. That was published from 1732 to 1758. It gives you home advice about how to take care of an illness, or wives' tales and things. It also discusses when you should plant your crops and what the weather outlook's going to be for the year. Ben Franklin is an interesting and historical American figure. He's done everything from make bifocal glasses to print this almanac, to even do work on the potbelly stove. He's quite the Renaissance man and should be discussed with reverence. We need to understand that there are about 50 public libraries and about 40 printing presses in the colonies. This is going to further enhance our literacy rate and education. It's also going to later eventually help spur the revolution. We should take a look at colonial government styles during this time. 8 of the 13 colonies had royal governors appointed by the king, and 3 of the colonies were business-style proprietary colonies whose governor was chosen for them. So only 2 colonies over here are actually electing their own governors. That's Connecticut and Rhode Island, and we've discussed in class and in other presentations here the interesting part about Rhode Island. We do need to make mention of the Connecticut fundamental orders. We draw a lot of our Constitution from that. It's the most impressive early colonial government document that there is. We need to understand that the Americans enjoyed a very high standard of living. This is pretty much the best place in the world to live. They had more political, religious, and economic opportunity than anyone in the world. They're definitely well fed. This helps us later in the revolution as our people become bigger, faster, and stronger.